Okay, so I think let's get started because we're gonna start with some introductions anyway. Welcome everyone joining the webinar today, Scaling Biotech Strategies to Overcome Growth Hurdles. I want to quickly mention a few things just to get the logistics sorted out. So we will have a Q&A session at the end of this webinar. Make sure to use the Q&A box for your questions. We will answer the questions at the very end, so make sure to use that. We are not going to monitor the chat, so please use the Q&A box instead. At the very end of the webinar, when you close the webinar, there will be a survey at the end. So please feel free to let us know what you think of the webinar, as well as any feedback or suggestions you have for future webinar topics. All right, let's get started. So today we're here to welcome two speakers to share their thoughts on the strategy to overcome growth hurdles. So we're going to go to the next slide. So we are first going to start introducing Brandon McCorkle. Brandon is the CEO of SciNote, and Brandon has over 15 years of experience in technology, during which he founded and scaled multiple investor-backed startups and orchestrated a successful turnaround within a $2 billion plus healthcare system. Brandon has established both enterprise SaaS businesses and data science, data engineering software consultancies. Before getting into technology, he was a paramedic and a mental health technician for many years, participating in one of the first rollouts of EHR technology in the US. Brandon pursued advanced education in the area of technology management and at the University of Pennsylvania, receiving a Master's of Science in Technology Management with a focus on integrating technology and business. Brandon's passion lies in the intersection of technology and business, where he has consistently thrived and mentored aspiring entrepreneurs on navigating the complexities of rapid growth and product market fit. Brandon, do you want to quickly say hi to everyone?
Hi, everyone. Really excited to be here. Thanks, Teresa.
Perfect. Thank you, Brandon. And then I will also like to introduce Mark Fortner. Sorry. Mark is a seasoned entrepreneur and innovator with over 20 years of leadership experience in pharmaceutical and biotech research informatics. As the CEO of Aspen Biosciences, he spearheads the development of tailored solutions in genomics, proteomics, and cheminformatics, employing agile user-driven methodologies. Mark's experience spanned various domains, including drug discovery, cancer biology, research informatics, and knowledge management. His innovative approach to software development has led to the creation of cutting-edge applications such as Cocktail, a polypharmacy drug development tool for mapping the drug target space in pancreatic cancer, and most recently, Pipeline, a platform designed to help scientists plan, manage, and execute drug discovery programs. With a rich history in both early-stage startups and established pharmaceutical companies like Takeda and Pfizer, Mark has honed his skills in business strategy, software development, and project management. His contributions include developing advanced software applications for drug target identification and validation, as well as implementing innovative solutions for streamlined drug discovery processes. Welcome, Mark.
Well, thanks very much for having me, Teresa.
Perfect. Before we start, we're going to have a really short introduction. I promise this is going to be very short, just so that people know the background and the companies that Mark and Brandon are coming from. So SciNote is a lab digitalization company with the mission to help humanity benefit the most from science and to preserve research data for future generations. SciNote's electronic lab notebook is a leading e-LN with inventory, compliance, and team management tools. It is used by the FDA, USDA, and over 100,000 scientific professionals. SciNote is currently in the FedRAMP authorization process as part of our commitment to customer needs and the trust they place in our product. And a little bit about Aspen Biosciences, where Mark is from. Aspen Biosciences makes early-stage drug discovery easier through Pipeline, the program management platform. Aspen Biosciences' mission is to help customers grow new medicines, get new medicines into the hands of patients faster. Pipeline allows drug discovery teams to manage research operations using modules for projects, targets, literature, assay data, protein production, chemistry, registration, and inventory. Pipeline aligns teams from the boardroom to the bench, making it possible to collaborate more effectively with CROs and service partners. Plan, manage, and execute drug discovery programs with pipelines. Sorry, pipeline. All right, so this is at the end of our introduction. A reminder that please use the Q&A box for any questions, as we will go to the Q&A session at the end of the webinar. Now I'm going to hand this conversation over to Brendan to start our discussion on scaling biotech strategies to overcome growth hurdles. Brendan, please take over.
Cool. Thank you, Teresa. And Mark, really happy to be able to dive in with you today. I thought the first one that we would start with is sort of to set the framework for the rest of our conversation. Let's start with what are some common challenges that biotech companies face when scaling up their operations?
So the first challenge I think that people have when scaling up their operations is really figuring out how much can I do with the resources that I have on hand. And so sometimes our customers come to us and they say, I need to go from 2 to 15 INDs over the next 5 years. How do I do that? And our job from an informatics perspective is to figure out how do they do that without totally disrupting their existing processes. How do they do that with the equipment that they already have, the software that they already have? How do they leverage all those investments and still get the job done? So that's the initial hurdle that people have to try to overcome. And then sort of secondarily, you need to kind of plan out that entire process. So if it's a 5-year time span, what technologies do you need to have in place over that 5-year period? When do you need to have them in place? What specific milestones are you trying to accomplish during that time frame? Do you have partnerships in place, and those partnerships are relying on having answers to questions in a given time frame? So, you have to take that into account as well whenever you're planning out this process.
So a lot of project management words in what you just said. So I think this maps to what we see, where a lot of early lab work, scientists are doing project management, but they're doing project management in tools that aren't hypothesis driven. And so I've always thought that this is sort of ironic, because here we have scientists who you think would default to doing things, the scientific method, but something about the shape of project that we're talking about here in business sort of pulls them outside of that comfort zone. So we see a push to sort of pull them back in. There are tools that are hypothesis driven. And some of the danger there is that we're then operating in a place that makes it really hard to have fair data standards. So we've talked a little bit before about something that I like to call the air gap, which is the breakdown in communications that happen as we're introducing tools and processes, people, technology, partnerships, like you mentioned, where we don't have good communication between them. And we've certainly seen that a lot of collaborations fail because they have a breakdown in communication. But I think that I want to sort of go one layer deeper into FAIR a little bit. I think I may be stealing some of the thunder from the question I wanted to ask, which is everyone's talking about FAIR. I think we're all suffering from the breakdowns of not having FAIR, but where specifically does the lack of FAIR standards and sort of mismatched processes or tools, what does that show up like? How do people see the gap here in FAIR data standards?
So they see it in a couple different areas. We've noticed it with customers when they're having internal conversations amongst themselves. So you might have labs that are part of a sequential workflow. And the people working on one step of that process, like protein production, for example, and they work together hand in hand with a group of chemists. But if the vocabularies that people use in protein production are different than the ones in chemistry, that can cause problems. I've seen arguments break out in meetings people were using the same term and had completely different meanings. And so, once you discover that you do have this disconnect, then you have to go about addressing it and coming up with a sort of common vocabulary. Externally, whenever working with partners, we see this the same problem appear as well. Here, people are trying to communicate information about maybe assays that they want a CRO to run for them. They have different expectations about the protocol to be used for that assay, or different expectations about the end results, the data they're supposed to be getting back from the CRO. If, for example, you're not as familiar as you should be, perhaps, with the protocol being used, then you can make assumptions about that, and then find yourself in conflict with your partner. And then thirdly, we see the problem occur between biotech companies and pharmaceutical companies whenever they're working together in these collaborative projects. Here, they're trying to share data. Oftentimes, the pharmaceutical company is maybe coming up to speed on a new technology platform or a new modality, and they may not be as familiar with the technology or the data being generated. And so having questions not only about what does this data represent, but also how was this data created and analyzed? How did you get this result? Those are sort of key questions, and there's a lot of trust bound up in the answers to those questions. And we see, in the PMI Project Management Institute reported that a lot of these projects tend to break down simply because of a breakdown in trust, a breakdown in communication that fractures the trust that people are trying to build up between different parties.
And this is one of the biggest examples I can think of a high trust and very nerve-inducing relationship between the hiring company and the CRO, right? This is taking our IP, this is taking our invention and giving it to another party to do some work to and hand it back, and then we can take the ball and run with it again. And this is very often handing it outside of the business to the other. And there's plenty of challenges in collaboration with someone sitting across from you in the lab. This is now somebody at a different company, right? So this is a very high stakes collaboration. Now, the good news is that there are lots of processes that people can follow. There are examples of patterns that work more and less. There's also lots of tech tools that help tackle these challenges. So I want to sort of take a moment. Each of us has an offering that is somewhat in this space, but what sort of tools do you think address this gap or this opportunity to really tighten the communication better or worse? And what should people be thinking about as they look at tools like this for being a better or a worse fit for the problem space?
Yeah. So I think, first of all, we need to kind of step back and ask ourselves, do the tools that you have or that you're depending on provide the ability to be able to map data to an ontology so that it can be fair? Can you make the data that you have fair? That's the first question that you should be asking yourself. And use that as sort of the criteria when you go in to try to evaluate different solutions. I think what you and I have both seen in this industry is the gradual adoption by different organizations of fair standards for exchanging data. And this is an ongoing process. It's not by any means complete, but there are a variety of different organizations like the Pistoia Alliance that is implementing different tools for assessing how fair your organization is and assessing some of the gaps that you might have. In terms of fair tools, I think, here at Aspen, we built metadata into the foundation of pipeline. So you can import ontologies into the system. You can use those ontologies to define fields and use that metadata throughout the application. And we also have another application called Farm Exchange, which is used to exchange data with CROs. And that metadata is used with Farm Exchange as well. So it basically keeps everybody on the same page.
I think this piece is really important. And for the audience, one of the most practical pieces of advice in evaluating these is there are some words that are disproportionately important when you're evaluating vendors. And Mark just used one of them. So metadata, think of a very simple workflow for us at the bench, someone using an ELN or not. They take a measurement on a scale and they either write it down. A very common use case for ELNs is they'll take a picture of it, so there's a record of it, and it's a sort of a higher trust version than writing it down. This picture then ends up into a digital system. How does it end up in the digital system? Is it just there as the binary, as the developers call it? Is it just the picture? Can it be shared? Can you see it? Where can you see it? Is there information about it? Metadata is like, where was it taken? When was it taken? Maybe there's some increase in trust because you can verify that it was taken in that lab on the day that the entry was taken, right? These start to build towards higher trust and higher fidelity data. But you need to have that metadata for that to be really powerful. The other one that we think is really important is tooling that has strong API connectivity and good documentation about the API. This is really the meat of the I in FAIR, and the I stands for interoperable. So the hubris that I've talked about in other venues of the vendors coming in and saying, hey, you can use ours, but you have to use only ours, and you don't need the rest of the stuff that you have. We're dealing with very complicated workflows in very complicated companies, often with collaborating with other companies, and each of these sort of abstraction layers increase all of the boundaries between these players. And if those boundaries can be fluid and data can go back and forth, it's a wonderful thing. Every one of those boundaries that isn't is an opportunity for this communication to break down. This is where we think that 50% number Mark talked about earlier comes from. It's just simple breakdowns in between the pieces of this machine. Not all vendors have a good API, not all vendors have good documentation, but it's a signal about their willingness to play nicely with workflows that they haven't managed yet, with other vendors, with legacy systems and processes you have internal in your business. So these are two words that get you pretty far into the pie. We also have a bias building tools for scientists that we think that this is another place of triangulation is, was the software built for the workflow we're talking about? So were these tools built by scientists or former scientists? Are they built for scientists, or are they a more general solution? There's lots of general solutions for project management, but there's lots of particularities to this type of project that we're talking about today. So we see, for example, the last example I gave is there's lots of science that's done with a nonlinear workflow. And so we have a lot of users who are trying to map nonlinear workflows into something that's incredibly linear, like a table in their lens. They're forcing a shape into another shape, and this then creates a lot of friction, as opposed to tooling that was built for that first shape is supposed to reduce friction, right? So we want people to feel like they're using less technology. We want to feel like they're getting closer to the hard parts of their job, not having new jobs chasing their technology. So some of these things will be artifact from things that were built from folks with a history in this space. And I think I mentioned a piece that becomes almost a philosophical argument, which is the sort of use all of one, use a platform, have one vendor that does all of the things, or assemble a little bit of a tech stack of your own where you have best in breed solutions for the ones that you need. You can turn them up and down. You can reassemble them if it's not working. So I'd be curious, Mark, from your view, how do you feel about where we are in the market right now? I feel like this is a pendulum. If you step back in time long enough, we sort of go hard one way and then we compensate too far the other. What do you think the pros and cons of are each? Where do you think we are right now in the market with that appetite?
Yeah, I think with a lot of the vendors that we see out there, they are they're really focused on making sure that the solutions that they have, either that they brought in via acquisition or that they have partnered with, that those are well integrated. That's kind of their first step. But I think what they don't really take advantage of is partnerships, and they don't take advantage of them well. Too often we encounter customers who have sort of accreted systems over time. You know, they've bought systems that maybe different ELNs, different inventory systems, different registration systems, what have you. And they don't want those investments to be replaced necessarily, because there's an inherent replacement cost, not just the cost of the licenses, but the cost in retraining your entire staff in order to be able to make best use of these applications. And so from our perspective, we always used a plugin based architecture by default. So when we built Pipeline, we said, we should never assume that we're the end all and be all, because somebody always has something that is very specific for their needs. And our job is merely to integrate with it and make it work. And so that's the philosophy that we took. And I think we're gradually starting to see movements in that direction. And I'm kind of hopeful that we'll see it sort of a broad acknowledgement across the industry that more vendors should make use of fair standards to help share data. Ultimately, companies are implementing data lakes. Sometimes they call them data swamps, but basically they're trying to pull data together from multiple different sources into a single place where they can begin to analyze it and understand it, and then maybe use it to build machine learning models. But that first step in the process is just to be able to aggregate the data in a way that makes sense. And you kind of need fair metadata in order to help you do that.
Yeah, this is I like the analogy of a data swamp. I like to poke fun at ELN vendors because we are one. So I think we get to take some shots at ourselves and others, that especially those of us who are focused at the R&D end of the spectrum as opposed to manufacturing, we're moving more and more into as flexible as possible, as unstructured data as possible. This doesn't introduce boundaries on the actual creativity and thus the research and the output of the scientists. But the downstream impact of fully unstructured data is the highest, right? And so we have human entered data. That's where we think we sit. We have machine generated data. We have system generated data. All of those go somewhere. And then I think one of the things that you were just talking about jumped out at me is that another place to triangulate whether you have a sort of a partner forward or a plays nicely with others vendor is if how they answer the question, do you need to be the source of truth? I think there are vendors who say this all-in-one category would say, yep, you use ours, you use only ours. We're the new source of truth. This is another place of hubris. If you go to Pfizer, they already have one. So it's not on the table to come in and be the new source of truth. So this modular approach you're talking about, similarly for us, is recognizing that some of the landscape has already been set. One of our largest clients, we were the 6th ELN that they use, including one they built there themselves. That was number 5. So it's a very special stance to take when you go to a company like that and say, no, we're going to be the end all be all of all of your processes now, toss all of this other stuff out. If this weren't software and it were people, it would be like the new scientist coming in and saying, I've got it from here. The other 10 of you who've been here for a decade, they can go with all the information and the context in between their ears. We would never say that to members of the lab, but we seem to sometimes carry this forward like we would do this for other people and other places of software. So I think if we're trying to preserve that data and really reduce errors, of omission or data siloing. No, it should all be there. It's okay to have a new place to do the work, but let's make sure it plays nicely with the old way. You also mentioned something. I think it would be remiss for us to talk about anything having to do with technology or tooling in 2024 and not talk about AI. So I really appreciate that you didn't say AI for what it's worth. You said preparing for ML models, because I think we share the bias that really we're in the world of ML still, not yet AI. But I want to take a second to just talk a little bit about where we each think AI is or is about to be, and because it seems to be part of every conversation about technology coming into the end of last year and the beginning of this year.
Yeah, I think from my perspective, we're still at the monkey with the hammer stage. We're hitting a bunch of different problems and trying to figure out if this is the right hammer for solving those problems. And sometimes we get interesting answers, sometimes we get useful answers out of it, and sometimes we don't. And we're really just learning right now. And our expectations should be kept minimal, at this point. I would not kind of, go to the extreme and say this is, ready for production. That said, I think there are really good applications where things are working very well. If you take a look at AlphaFold, for example, I think we've seen some really interesting results that come out of that. We do have kind of limited data in which to build some of those models, and that shows up in those results. So there are a number of proteins for which we can probably never create models for them, simply because we've never been able to crystallize them to begin with. So it's impossible for us at this point to be able to predict future structures from them.
I think there's interesting space there in lab automation too. I think some of the machine learning models are really good at dealing with things that are very pattern laden, so repetitive tasks, or thinking of making suggestions for metadata, or hey, you've used this protocol before, but even would you like to look at this research? It sure looks like the research you just published. But these things are still pretty heavy on the ML side of the machine learning side of the spectrum, where I think the tactical impact of these things are still more like advanced search or suggest auto completion, things that we take for granted in other pieces of software, but get to be pretty cool when they're making efficiencies in a drug pipeline. But they're still, I think, shy of AI. The biggest use case that we saw, we actually dabbled with an AI project a couple of years ago, and it was too early, which I think might be a good use case for today's webinar, because we're talking about scaling. One of the things that happens when you scale a business is that parts of your business are not ready to scale. So if you take, we had a piece of software called Manuscript Writer, and it was used in LLM, not the big ones that we're talking about now, because this was 3 years ago. And it would take the materials and methods, because your experimental design and output and results were in the ELN, and it could populate a pretty healthy part of your manuscript. And we call it reporting. This could be publication if it was external, or reporting if it was internal, but creating basically the document, the story and context around your work. And it was very good at combining all of these things. However, the market didn't have an LLM that was for biotech, that was security forward, that was not publicly sharing the data, which was a really hard game. So the making it work technically, boom, there, selling it to people who didn't trust it years early. So we put it back on the shelf. That can be a painful conversation when you have something really cool, right? And I think at the core of every business, it comes down to, can you make a widget for cheaper than people will pay for it? And if someone's going to say, no, I don't trust this, maybe that means the value they'll pay for it is zero. It's real hard to make it for less than that, right? So right. We definitely see some use cases there. Now we're coming into the last back half here, so I want to make sure we have time for questions. And we have quite a few from before we get joined today, as well as live today. So let me just peek at this really quickly as we wrap AI. So the last one that I thought would be the last two rather before we go into questions were because we're talking about scaling and challenging of scaling. Could you give an example that you think is a really good example of a collaboration that helped a company scale, sort of the pre and post state?
So I think probably one of the best examples that I've seen of scaling, I think it's all too common nowadays that where people are actually making use of they're making use of cloud-based tools to scale up their informatics solutions. So originally, when this got started, I'd say about 15 years ago, it was very difficult for pharmaceutical companies to figure out what to do with the cloud. They were still in the mode of having large server farms that they controlled physical access to, and that was really important. So if you talk to Pfizer at the time, their cloud solution was we'll build it for you in Groton. And at that time, this was basically the standard operating procedure for most pharmaceutical companies. But I think we started to see companies like J&J start to explore using cloud-based platforms. And when they started to do that, they realized the first step that they had to do was to provide a means of evaluating the security of that platform. And that was their first step that they did, is they, before they even allowed scientists to start using the cloud, they made sure that it was a secure environment for them, and they had guarantees in place of that security. And I think regarding any kind of adoption in new technology, that's one of the first things that you should be evaluating is taking a look at security, taking a look at fit for purpose. Those are just some of the basic things that you have to do in order to do this kind of job.
I think that's a good example. Cloud has come a long way. When I started my last company, people were horrified at the prospect of using the cloud, and I think that this has evolved into some folks saying that it's safer. The analogy I was told is we talk about Bob. Bob is responsible for patching the server that's under somebody's desk when you're at a small company, right? And so companies are small, they're scrappy. This is great. You have to have somebody watch this. But what are the chances that Bob's going to be 100% current with all of the work and all of the potential exploits? And the major cloud providers have 10,000 Bobs. So the chances that they're going to close that hole nigh immediately is very high. The chance of actual Bob, maybe going home or going on vacation and leaving that open, most of the ransomware attacks in the major health systems in the US have been on-premise solutions, not on cloud, for example. So I think the more that this happens, as unfortunate as bad activities are, the more that this happens, the more I think confidence grows in the cloud side. There are still some regulatory reasons and some operating principles where people must do on-premise, but I think the security piece seems to be moving towards cloud, which is really cool. Final regularly scheduled question: what advice would you give to biotech entrepreneurs and/or executives who are embarking on the journey of actively scaling their companies right now?
I think the key to scaling any kind of drug discovery operation is number one, having a really good understanding of what you have in place, and also an admission that you will probably have to change your processes in order to make your company scale more effectively. This is something that we see a lot of in this space. The workflow that you use to handle 2 programs in your drug discovery pipeline doesn't scale to handle 15. And you have to admit that and kind of realize, well, what kind of an environment do you want to work in? How do we make this work? And then you need to evaluate technologies and to help you get there. For us, that tends to mean we go into a customer site and we take a look at how they do drug discovery. We figure out where the pain points are. We figure out where there are inefficiencies, and we help them evaluate solutions that might help solve those problems.
Well, I think we touched a little bit already on-prem versus cloud security, which is one of the questions. We can sort of pin that if we have time to come back to at the end. Our next pre-question was, when do you decide if the company should do in-house or outsource research, with a flag of the difficulties of IP protection in regards to outsourcing? Mark, I think this is super time relevant given some of the legislation moves that are afoot. So I thought that would be a good one to jump in. How do you feel about IP protection, the pros and cons of outsourcing, and what we should be thinking about when we think about the stuff happening in the legislative environment right now?
Yeah, I think, we all live in a very fluid environment today. Back in January, the US government started this biosecure legislation, and it really targets, I think, 6 or 7 particular CROs that would basically be sort of taken off the board as far as the ability for US companies to be able to do business with them. I think anytime you're doing business with a CRO, anytime you're going outside your own firewalls or your own virtual private cloud, there's a certain amount of risk in that. And you should always be taking a sort of security first approach when dealing with third parties. And, those third parties can be anywhere in the world. So I think what we're seeing as sort of a trend is that some of the companies are starting to take a look internally and asking themselves, well, how much of this can we do internally? Even though this could present scaling issues for us, because now there are fewer projects that we can pursue with the internal resources that we have. So we have to be more careful with those resources. We may have to figure out better ways of automating, because it's just physically impossible to try to have chemists hand pipetting plates, for example. So I think, right now the key challenge for most drug discovery companies is really, how do I evaluate those potential CRO partners? How do I make sure that we are secure? How do I make sure that those companies have policies that preclude them from sharing my IP with other entities? And that's something that every company has to evaluate on their own. You need to take advice from where you can get it. There are plenty of organizations out there that can help, from intelligence organizations to cybersecurity professionals. But I think it's an important issue that we have to come to grips with, and we have to do contingency planning. Because of that fluid environment that we live in, it's not just a matter of the potential for IP to spring legs and walk out the door. It's also the potential of conflicts throughout the world to disrupt what our supply chains and what we're trying to do. I think the chemistry world has been really impressed with the work that Enamine has done. Their CEO came on, they're a Ukrainian company, and their CEO made an announcement at the outbreak of the war saying, please bear with us, we will be up and running soon. and within a month, their operations were restored. In that month, it was very nerve-wracking for a lot of companies because they were madly looking around for alternative sources. But I think everybody in the community has been really impressed with their response. And so we do need to make sure that we are doing proper contingency planning when it comes to dealing with CROs and identifying potential backup sources of help in this process.
Similarly, when people think about software tooling, people also think about the hardware costs involved. And this last answer reminded me, especially if people are thinking about bringing a CRO function in-house, one of the things that they have to think about is then not the people and the process cycle times, but also hardware that they may not have to carry. So how do you think about the assessment of go, no go on some larger decisions along the scaling journey, like a large piece of hardware?
So one of our customers is currently pulling a lot of their synthesis work in-house, and they are setting up a facility in Texas to be able to really do automated chemistry at scale. And in the process of doing that, I think they're learning a lot about what they need to have in place. I think their primary challenge is not having enough space. Their primary challenge is really just coordinating work between multiple different sites. And when you bring stuff in-house, you have to make sure that everybody is literally on the same page when it comes to managing the requests that are coming in, when it comes to managing expectations. So even though you're dealing with another site, it's almost like you're dealing with another CRO. They just happen to be internal to the company.
And maybe a third edge of this shape, one of the questions that came in over Zoom, can you provide insights into the cost effectiveness of implementing technology solutions for scaling? i.e., how do you justify the investment?
So I think the real question here is figuring out what is your board going to be comfortable with. So when we think about this, we think about bringing stuff in-house. The major question that the people have to ask is, how do I justify this to the board? How are we going to do this? And basically, it's a trade-off. What are your costs for doing business externally versus internally? You're going to have startup costs associated with this. But beyond those startup costs, what are your run costs like? How does that compare with the run costs of running this through a CRO? How does that compare with the cycle times? If it takes longer to do this through the CRO, what kinds of risks does that present the company? We see that a lot just in sort of the outside of the drug industry, but in fashion and other areas where it may take a month or so to actually get a design change through maybe an offshore manufacturer and then back to you. And that same thing might be done internally in a few weeks, a few days. And so the question then becomes, is it worthwhile to us to do this internally and do it faster? And what advantage does that bring to the table? Is that worthwhile to the company? And that's just a question that the board will have to answer.
We have a take on this too. There's a lot of advantages to using digital tools over analog tools, right? So part of this is the value that you're getting at it. Do you have faster cycle times? Are you getting things through the pipeline faster? A lot of times this is because avoiding rework and rerunning experiments because of better collaboration. But at least for our part of the stack, we're also seeing that a lot less administrative time gets used to have these. So if you have 10 scientists on your team and they're spending 15% less time on admin, you start building up this queue of hours, and this turns into a story that, you know, if you have 1,000 hours of researchers, you're actually getting 250 more hours of science out of that block of time. And that's a pretty strong story towards, you know, however you use that time. That might be different lab by lab or industry by industry, but it's hard to argue that having, you know, this quarter of time that was getting blocked by non-scientific work available for scientific work either allows you to get more through the pipeline or to do it with fewer people. Both of those are advantageous in business. So this is usually a very big part for us in justifying the investment. And it's always a little bit of an interesting one when you have a small business, because I think, you know, Mark, you just mentioned paying a little bit more to go faster, but this is an investment and you actually have to have the capital to make that investment. So unfortunately, sometimes you have to pick one thing over the other, or these are benefits that only happen when you have the capital to spend. So I think much like other decisions in business, you have to be pretty ruthless in what the priority is. If you can only do your top 3 things, all right, does the return from this investment actually put it into your top 3, or can you do something more slowly, or can you absorb the risk like we were talking about earlier on the IP? So this is always a lot of it depenses coming from the two of us today, guys, is what I'm saying.
Right. Yeah, I think one thing I should point out too is that part of what we built into Pipeline was a tool that's designed really to help address this question. You know, you have a milestone coming up, you have a series of scientific questions that you want answered. You have a series of assays, a series of compounds that you need to have created. So you plan all of that out, and you have to ask yourself, okay, if I run these 5 assays through a CRO, what is it going to cost me versus what is it going to cost me to run it internally? Mm-hmm. And you want to be able to do that kind of analysis in order to figure out, does this make economic sense for us as a business? You know, is this something that that we're just going to have to keep doing it the way that we're doing? So this type of calculus is a sort of an ongoing part of the business process that that people have to be prepared to tackle. But also they need to be able to think about this in terms of if I have to go for a Series B fundraise, now at least I know how much it's going to cost me, how much to ask for, you know. You know, you can go to your investors and say, here are the main programs that we're working on, the key questions that we're trying to answer, and we need X amount of money in order to get there.
Yes. I can confirm, as someone who has both failed and succeeded to raise money, that the beginning version of my journey, where my answer to what would you use this money for was to do more of all of the stuff, was not a good enough answer to raise the money. And actually having very, very discrete, I need item A, person B, times C because of this set of results, this starts being, you know, you're starting to do the underwriting of the fundraise for the investors. And that's certainly a beneficial thing to do. One of the other pieces of this that's hard to think about, and I think should be weighted when people are making these decisions, is a lot of the outsourcing actually creates an option for the spend that isn't present when you do it in-house. So you are potentially renting the machine, whether it's a server for software or a microscope or something much more sophisticated than a microscope. If you're using an outsourced vendor and you need to stop and change direction, you get to turn it off whole hog, and potentially very, very quickly if it's outsourced. You might be carrying more cost per unit of time, but you have the option to turn it off. When you do it in-house, you have already bought that microscope. You have already bought the server and set it up to run and hired the staff to run it. It's a very different proposition to slow down or change tack with some of these things. And so there is a very interesting tension between these two. And I think where the market is, where your board is, where your fundraising is, may make you weight those things more or less. And then I think in a lot of conversations about scale, I see this underrepresented as what's the value of being able to stop or turn the knob down in our operations.
Right. Yeah, I completely agree. We see that a lot in with our customers as well. Figuring out how agile can we be? Can we stop on a dime, basically? Halt some portion of our process in order to still achieve our goals, but make sure that we're still solving in the process.
Great. I think we have time to maybe wrap one more, and I think the one I see is interesting because it talks about the people part of all of this. We've been spending a lot of time talking about the technology. So we have a question about tackling the onboarding process, specifically the time and the time consumption of introducing new processes when we all feel like there isn't any time because we're scaling. So maybe a little bit of this slowing down to speed up. How do you think about the temptation to not slow down and just keep going fast, or rating when it's time to pause, introduce a new process, a new solution, a new piece of machinery?
Yeah, I think we see two different approaches. We see people deciding that they want to put a new technology or a new process into place and put it into the critical path of a project that they're working on. And then we see the opposite of that, in which they are averse to doing that, and what they really want to do is to maybe try to tackle that as a research project with a sort of open timeline.
Mm-hmm.
And I think both of those approaches are valid. It really kind of depends on how risk averse the organization is. It depends on how critical that particular technology is or process is to solving this problem. All of those things are things that CSOs and companies are definitely weighing out as they evaluate new technologies. I think from our perspective as technology implementers, we have to be mindful of the disruption that we are causing in these organizations, and we have to do everything that we can to minimize that disruption. And as I said earlier, this is part of the reason why we have a sort of plug-in based approach to our software, because we don't want to disrupt their operations. We want to make them more efficient and less time consuming. But we want them to be able to get new medicines out the door faster. That's ultimately our goal. And that's the goal that most vendors have, at least if it's not their primary goal, it's a secondary or tertiary goal that they have when they're working with their customers. So keeping in mind that we have these two extremes for customers, I think those process changes can be brought on at whatever speed the people are willing to put up with. Now, if there's too much happening in the organization to be able to do that, then you have to figure out either a different parallel timeline with maybe a core set of key stakeholders, and you want to use those stakeholders basically as advocates or champions for this new process or this new technology that you want to bring on board. I think both of us are acutely aware that nothing succeeds like success. And so what you want is scientists whose opinions you value to have vetted something and say, this looks good. We're able to get X amount of work done faster using this method. Let us show you the results. And I think what really matters in most of these cases is making sure that as you're implementing these technologies, as you're implementing these process changes, that you gather the metrics that demonstrate that. You should never go in and implement a technology without gathering metrics as to how it's affecting your operations, because you need to be able to go back and demonstrate the fact that this has added value to what we do.
Yeah, I think that's a nice point to end on, is that it's very easy to get distracted by the appeal of a new process or a new vendor or a new piece of technology, and then move away from realizing that there are people behind all of these decisions and all of these workflows. And so we already talked about Bob in the server farm, but there's maybe Sarah in the chemistry lab and Robert in the biology lab, and one of them doesn't really want to not use paper anymore, and the other one doesn't want to use the words that the biologist asked for the collaboration. And so these are real points of friction in terms that impact the success of any of those individual operational moves. But if it can be mapped back towards a shared vision, like, hey, we're doing change A, B, or C because medications to humans faster, right? This then softens the weight of the change, as does just remembering that there's people and that people don't really like change. And if it's not change for change's sake, then maybe they'll, try some of this stuff and listen to the evidence that you just talked about. So really appreciate that perspective. Mark, we're coming right into time now. So I think we should wrap for our schedule for today. So to everyone who's still with us, thank you for your time. Appreciate you joining us as we talked about scaling challenges in biotech. Please complete the survey. This is really helpful for us. We will have on-demand video of this available likely tomorrow. So please feel free to share. We will all be happy to answer questions. If anyone didn't feel theirs got addressed, we can do those offline. And if it's big enough, we can send to the list of attendees as well. So don't be shy. Thank you for your time. Thank you for the survey. And Mark, thank you for joining us and spending some time with us today.
Thanks so much, Brendan. And thank you, Teresa, for helping to host this as well.